I'm sorry, Janwoo. You're incredible, but I actually value my life.
That was the 8th woman this year.
I'm sorry, Chanwoo. You're incredible, but I actually value my life. The heavy crystal decanter collided with the floor, amber liquid and jagged glass spraying across the Persian rug. The guards outside the bedroom door didn't flinch. They were used to the sounds of violence, but they didn't realize the violence tonight was purely emotional. Inside, a woman was frantically pulling her dress over her head, her hands shaking as she avoided Chanwoo's gaze. I can't do this. I'll end up in the ER, she whispered, her voice cracking as she grabbed her heels and bolted for the exit. The door clicked shut, and the silence that followed was heavier than any lead bullet. Chanwoo stood by the window, his reflection showing a man who looked like a god but felt like a monster. That was the 8th woman this year. 8 women who wanted his money and his power, but were terrified of his reality. To the world, he was the untouchable boss. In this room, he was just a freak. His burner phone vibrated on the nightstand. It was his lead enforcer. Boss, the shipment is compromised. We need your call. Chanwoo stared at the phone before sweeping it off the table in a fit of silent rage. The streets could burn for all he cared. He was tired of being a king in a hollow castle. He closed his eyes, his mind drifting back to 48 hours ago, back to the neon lights of the club where he first saw her. The woman who didn't look away. If you want to know how the story ends and whether Chanwoo finally finds the one woman who stays, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss the twist in the end. Chanwoo sat at the head of the obsidian conference table, the cool air of the 62nd floor boardroom doing little to soothe the simmering irritation beneath his skin. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city he owned stretched out like a sprawling carpet of amber lights and gray concrete. To anyone else, this was the summit of human achievement. To Chanwoo, it was just a very expensive cage. At the other end of the table, Elder Park was droning on about the distribution logistics for the new Southside territory. The man was a relic, a holdover from Chanwoo's father's era, and he spoke with a rhythmic cadence that usually commanded absolute attention. Today, however, the words were nothing more than white noise. The margins are tight, but if we squeeze the local unions, we can see a 20% increase by Q3, Park said, tapping a baccarat crystal pen against a stack of reports. Chanwoo? Your thoughts on the union pressure? Chanwoo didn't look up. His gaze was fixed on a microscopic scratch in the polished wood of the table. His mind was miles away, trapped in the suffocating silence of his penthouse an hour earlier. He could still hear the frantic click of heels on marble, still see the way the light had caught the tears of terror in that woman's eyes. I could actually get hurt. The phrase looped in his brain like a cursed mantra. Boss. The voice of Minho, his younger, more observant lieutenant, broke the spell. Chanwoo blinked, his dark eyes finally focusing on the expectant faces surrounding him. 12 men, the most dangerous figures in the tri-state area, were waiting for a single nod from him to ruin 1,000 lives. The unions are a distraction, Chanwoo said, his voice a low, raspy baritone that instantly cut through the tension. Double the kickback to the port authorities instead. If the cargo moves without inspection, the margins don't matter. We don't squeeze people who can strike. We buy the people who make sure the strike never starts. Elder Park nodded slowly, a look of grudging respect crossing his weathered face. Pragmatic. As always. Chanwoo felt a wave of nausea. Pragmatic. Powerful. Untouchable. The adjectives were piled onto him like layers of armor, yet he felt naked. He looked at his hands, large and scarred from a youth spent proving he was his father's son. These hands could crush a man's windpipe, sign a $1 million wire transfer, or dismantle a rival's reputation in a single afternoon. But they couldn't hold a woman without making her feel like she was being hunted by a giant. He stood up abruptly, the heavy leather chair groaning against the floor. Minho, finished the briefing. Send the totals to my private terminal. But we haven't discussed the Melanov expansion, Park protested, rising slightly from his seat. Chanwoo paused at the door, his silhouette cutting a sharp, intimidating figure against the backdrop of the skyline. The Melanovs are dogs barking at a fence, Park. If they cross it, kill them. If they stay behind it, ignore them. I have matters that require my actual attention. He stepped out into the hallway, his boots echoing with a lonely, rhythmic thud. His security detail fell in line behind him like shadows, silent and lethal. He hated them. He hated the way they looked at the back of his head with a mixture of awe and fear. He hated the way the elevator doors glided open instantly because his biometric signature was detected. As the elevator descended, the digital floor counter blurred. He was a king with no queen, a titan with a defect he couldn't fix with money or blood. He pulled his phone from his silk vest, staring at the blank screen. No personal messages. No casual check-ins. Just encrypted alerts about shipments and casualties. The elevator reached the garage and he stepped into the back of the armored sedan. "Drive," he commanded. "Where to, boss?" the driver asked. Chanwoo leaned his head back against the headrest and closed his eyes. He thought about the whiskey he'd thrown, the glass he'd shattered, and the hollow ache in his chest that no amount of power could fill. He was the most successful man in the city, and he had never felt like a bigger failure. "Anywhere with a heartbeat," he whispered, though the glass partition was up and the driver couldn't hear him. "Just drive." The armored sedan glided through the rain-slicked streets of the meatpacking district, a silent predator moving through a sea of neon and steam. Chanwoo watched the blurred lights of the city smear across the tinted window, his reflection ghostly and hollow. He didn't want the silence of his penthouse, and he certainly didn't want the sterile, worshipful environment of his offices. He needed noise, the kind that drowned out the echo of a slamming door and the phantom sting of a woman's pity. "The Crimson Lotus, boss?" the driver asked, glancing at the rearview mirror. "No," Chanwoo replied, his voice a low rumble. "Take me to Oix. I want to see if the management is still skimming the door tax." It was a lie and they both knew it. Oix was a high-end gentleman's club under Chanwoo's protection, but it wasn't a place he frequented. It was too raw, too honest in its exchange of desire and currency. But tonight, honesty was exactly what he craved, even if it was bought. The club was a subterranean cathedral of bass and velvet. As Chanwoo entered, the air hit him like a physical weight, thick with the scent of expensive cologne, vanilla body oil, and the metallic tang of gin. The floor manager spotted him instantly, his face paling as he began to scramble toward the VIP section. But Chanwoo waved him off with a sharp, dismissive gesture. He didn't want the parade. He didn't want the light directed at him. He moved to a shadow-drenched corner of the secondary bar, ordering a double rye and keeping his back to the wall. From here, the main stage was a kaleidoscope of movement, a revolving door of performers who moved with practiced, bored sensuality. They were beautiful, certainly, but their eyes were always on the high rollers' wallets, their smiles tight and transactional. Then the music shifted. The heavy, aggressive hip-hop faded, replaced by a slow, atmospheric track driven by a deep, resonant cello and a haunting electronic beat. The lights dimmed until the stage was bathed in a single sharp spotlight of violet and gold. Miriam walked out. She didn't start with a pose or a practiced pout. She simply stood there for a moment, adjusting the silk wrap around her waist, her skin the color of rich espresso under the stage lights. She was tall, her muscles toned with the kind of athletic grace that suggested she spent as much time in a library or a lab as she did on a pole. When she began to move, the room seemed to tilt. She didn't look at the men leaning over the edge of the stage with hungry eyes. She didn't even look at the cameras. Her eyes were closed, her head tilted back as she gripped the chrome pole and vaulted herself upward with effortless strength. Chanwoo forgot to breathe. He had seen 1,000 dancers, but Miriam was different. She wasn't performing an act of seduction. She was performing an act of defiance. Every spin, every controlled descent, every flare of her legs was precise and powerful. She moved like she was alone in her own private sanctuary, using the music to exorcise something deep within herself. There was a fierce, untouchable dignity in the way she held her body, a strength that suggested she didn't need the approval of the room to know she was a queen. She was a nursing student, Victor had mentioned once in a passing report, a woman working 2 lives to build a third. In her movement, Chanwoo saw the grit of someone who had survived things far worse than a boardroom meeting. As the song reached its crescendo, Miriam spun into a rapid descent, stopping inches from the floor with a sudden, jarring grace. She opened her eyes then, and for a split second, her gaze swept across the dark corner where Chanwoo sat. In that moment, the untouchable boss felt a strange, terrifying jolt of electricity. Most people looked at him and saw a checkbook or a death warrant. But in the brief flash of her amber eyes, he felt like she saw through the Italian wool and the diamond cufflinks. She didn't look afraid. She looked bored by the posturing of the world around her. She stood up, draped her silk wrap back over her shoulders, and walked off the stage without waiting for the applause or the rain of bills. She had given the room her art, but she had kept herself. Chanwoo set his glass down on the bar, his hand finally steady. The hollow ache in his chest hadn't disappeared, but it had changed shape. He realized he didn't just want to watch her. He wanted to know how someone could be that exposed and yet remain so completely invulnerable. "Victor," Chanwoo murmured into his earpiece, his eyes still fixed on the curtain where she had disappeared. "Clear the back lounge. I want 5 minutes with the girl who just finished the violet set. And tell the manager if he interrupts us, he's out of a job." The back lounge of Oix was a sanctuary of dim amber lighting and heavy, soundproofed velvet. When Chanwoo entered, the air was still, a stark contrast to the vibrating bass of the main floor. Miriam was already there, draped over a tufted leather chair. She hadn't changed out of her performance gear, but she had wrapped a translucent black sarong around her waist. She was focused on her hands, calmly peeling a strip of athletic tape from her palm. Chanwoo didn't sit. He stood in the center of the room, the weight of his tailored suit and the reputation that preceded him acting as a physical pressure. He pulled a thick clip of $100 bills from his pocket and tossed it onto the low marble table between them. The sound was a dull thud, the sound of a man who believed every problem had a price tag. "That's for your next 3 sets, Chanwoo said, his voice regaining the cold, authoritative edge he used in the boardroom. "Stay here. Talk to me." Miriam didn't even look at the money. She finished peeling the tape, balled it up, and finally lifted her gaze. Her eyes weren't filled with the wide-eyed submission he was used to. They were tired, sharp, and entirely unimpressed. "Is that how you do it, Chanwoo?" she asked. Her voice was smoother than the rye he'd been drinking, but it carried a bite. "You find something you don't understand and you try to put a reserved sign on it?" Chanwoo stiffened. "I'm paying for your time. Most women in this building would be thrilled." "I'm not most women, and I'm definitely not thrilled," she said, standing up slowly. She was tall, and even in her bare feet, she held her head with a level of dignity that made Chanwoo feel like he was the one being scrutinized. She walked toward him, stopping just outside his personal space. The scent of vanilla and sweat rolled off her, the scent of hard work, not luxury. "You didn't come back here because you wanted to dance," she said, her eyes searching his. "You came back here because you look like a man who's been dying of thirst in the middle of a palace. You've got all this power, all this money, and yet you're sitting in a dark corner of a strip club looking like someone just told you the world was ending." Chanwoo's jaw tightened. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," Miriam countered. She gestured vaguely toward the door. "I see guys like you every night. You think the suit makes you untouchable, but it's just a shell. You're hiding something. Maybe you're lonely, maybe you're broken, or maybe you're just bored of people saying yes before you even finish a sentence." She reached out, her fingers hovering inches from the lapel of his coat, but she didn't touch him. "Put your money back in your pocket, boss. If you want to talk to me, do it as a man, not a customer. I don't sell my conversation. I give it to people who are interesting enough to keep me from falling asleep." Chanwoo felt a flush of heat creep up his neck. It wasn't rage, it was a jarring, electric sense of shame. She had stripped him down more effectively with 3 sentences than any rival had with a blade. He looked at the money on the table, which suddenly looked vulgar and small. "I've had a bad night," he admitted, the words feeling heavy and foreign in his throat. "We all have bad nights," Miriam said, her expression softening just a fraction. "The difference is I don't take mine out on my bank account. I take them out on the pole." "What do you do, Chanwoo? Besides throw bottles and intimidate the help?" The silence that followed was different from the poison gas of his penthouse. This was a clean silence, a clearing of the air. Chanwoo reached down, picked up the money, and shoved it back into his vest. He took a breath, letting the tension leave his shoulders for the first time in days. "I usually just stay quiet," he said quietly, "and hope the silence doesn't swallow me whole." Miriam watched him for a long moment, seeing the flicker of the freak he felt like inside, and for the first time she smiled. It wasn't a performer's smile. It was a real, lopsided grin that reached her eyes. "Better," she said. "Now sit down. You have 5 minutes." Make them count, or I'm going back out there to earn that money for real. Chanwoo sat. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the one in control, and to his absolute shock, he realized he didn't want to be. He just wanted her to keep looking at him like he was human. The following Tuesday, the world of concrete and blood felt like a distant memory. Chanwoo had done the unthinkable. He had dismissed his security detail 3 blocks away from the small, nondescript coffee shop in the West Village. He felt exposed, the absence of his shadows like a missing limb, but as he stepped into the warm, roasted bean scent of the cafe, he realized the anonymity was a shield of its own. Miriam was already there, tucked into a corner booth. She wasn't the shimmering violet specter from the stage. She wore an oversized cream sweater and thick-rimmed glasses, her hair pulled back into a soft puff. A stack of thick medical textbooks sat on the table next to a steaming mug. For the first time, Chanwoo saw the nursing student, not the survivor, and the sight made his heart hammer against his ribs with more force than a gang war ever could. "You actually came," she said, closing a book on cardiovascular physiology. Her eyes scanned the empty space behind him. "And you didn't bring the small army. I'm impressed, Chanwoo." "I told you," he said, sliding into the booth. The wooden bench creaked under his frame. "I wanted to talk as a man. Men don't need 12 soldiers to buy a coffee." They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the espresso machine and the low chatter of students providing a sanctuary. For Chanwoo, the transition was jarring. In his world, silence was a weapon or a sign of impending betrayal. Here, under Miriam's steady, expectant gaze, it felt like an invitation. "So," she said, leaning forward, resting her chin on her palm, "you've had 48 hours to think about it? What is it that makes a man like you, someone who could have any woman in this city, sit in the dark and call himself a freak?" Chanwoo stiffened, his fingers tightening around the paper cup. He looked at her, searching for the mockery he'd seen in so many others, the hidden laughter or the eventual flinch. He saw only curiosity. "I have a complication," he started, the words tasting like ash. "People look at me and they see power. They see the suit, the money, the height. They think I'm the ultimate prize." He took a jagged breath, his gaze dropping to the table. "But in the bedroom it's different. It's not a gift. It's a burden. 7, no 8 women now. They get close, they see the reality of my size, and they run. They don't just leave, they panic. They act like I'm a monster that's going to break them." He waited for the punchline. He waited for her to make a joke about his ego or to look at him with that clinical, detached pity. Instead, Miriam didn't move. She didn't laugh. She didn't even blink. She just watched him, her expression thoughtful, as if she were diagnosing a wound rather than listening to a confession. 8 women, she mused softly. And I bet every single one of them was looking for the mafia boss. They wanted the fantasy, the dangerous man who would sweep them off their feet. And when they realized you were a physical reality they hadn't planned for, they weren't mature enough to handle it. Chanwoo looked up, surprised. "You think it's them?" "I think it's a lack of honesty," Miriam said. She reached across the table, her hand hovering just an inch from his, offering the choice of contact. "You're so afraid of being a monster that you probably act like one before you even take your shirt off. You expect them to run, so you give them a reason to. Fear is a two-way street, Chanwoo." "It's not just fear," he whispered. "It's the shame. Knowing that the one thing I can't control is the one thing that keeps me alone." "You aren't alone right now," she reminded him. Her fingers finally touched the back of his hand, a light, grounding pressure. "I've spent 3 years in clinical rotations. I've seen human bodies in every state of trauma, beauty, and complication you can imagine. You aren't a freak to me. You're just a man with a lot of heavy armor who doesn't know how to let someone help him take it off." For the first time in his adult life, the untouchable boss felt the pressure in his chest ease. He didn't have to be a king here. He didn't have to be a predator. Under the fluorescent lights of a cheap coffee shop, listening to a woman who saw him as a person rather than a paycheck, the silence finally stopped feeling like poison. "Why are you still sitting here?" he asked, his voice thick. "Why are you still sitting here?" he asked, his voice thick. Miriam smiled, the same lopsided, genuine grin from the club. "Because the coffee is decent and I've always liked the challenge. Besides," she teased, tapping the cover of her textbook, "I'm studying anatomy. I think I can handle yours." The serenity of the West Village afternoon shattered with the sound of screeching tires and the sudden violent percussion of a brick through glass. The coffee shop's front window exploded inward, raining diamond-like shards over the empty tables near the door. Chan-woo's instincts, honed by a decade of survival, took over before the dust could settle. He didn't think, he moved. In one fluid motion, he lunged across the table, his massive frame shielding Miriam as he tackled her to the floor behind the heavy oak counter. "Stay down. Don't move," he barked, his voice no longer the gentle baritone of a date, but the sharp command of a general. Outside, a black SUV had jumped the curb. Two men in hooded sweatshirts stepped out, but they weren't carrying the heavy artillery of a full-scale assassination. They had pipes and baseball bats, and one held a Molotov cocktail, its wick flickering with a hungry orange flame. This wasn't an execution, it was a message. The Melanovs were testing the perimeter, looking for the untouchable boss, who had supposedly gone soft and started walking the streets without his shadows. "Chan-woo, what's happening?" Miriam gasped, her face pressed against the cool tile floor. She was terrified, but she wasn't screaming. Her nursing training, or perhaps a harder past, kept her grounded even as the smell of gasoline began to waft through the broken window. "Just a business dispute that got out of hand," Chan-woo said, his eyes scanning the room for an exit. He felt a familiar, dark heat rising in his chest. He wanted to vault over the counter and tear those men apart. He wanted to show them why the name Chan-woo was whispered with fear. But he looked down at Miriam, at her glasses lying crooked on the floor and her medical textbook covered in glass, and he froze. If he fought the way he usually fought, the man she had just started to trust would vanish. She would see the monster everyone else saw. "The back door through the kitchen," he whispered, grabbing her hand. His grip was firm, a tether in the chaos. "We're going to run. Do not look back." The men outside began to smash the remaining windows, the rhythmic thud crack of wood on glass echoing like gunfire. One of them stepped over the threshold, shouting in a language Chan-woo knew all too well. They were looking for him. Chan-woo led Miriam through the narrow kitchen, past a stunned barista who was cowering near the industrial fridge. As they reached the heavy steel rear exit, the back of the shop erupted in light. The Molotov had been tossed. The smell of burning upholstery and old wood filled the air. In the narrow alleyway behind the shop, the air was cold and damp. Chan-woo didn't stop. He kept his body between Miriam and the street, his eyes darting to every shadow. He looked for his phone to call Minho, to order a scorched earth retaliation, but his hand stopped. Miriam was leaning against the brick wall, her breath coming in ragged hitches. She looked at him, her eyes wide, searching his face for the truth. "They were looking for you, weren't they?" she asked. Chan-woo stood there, his knuckles white as he gripped the handle of the service door. He could hear the sirens in the distance, the city's indifferent response to the violence he attracted. He looked like a king who had just watched his temple burn. "They were," he admitted, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "I tried to keep this world away from you, Miriam. I wanted one afternoon where I wasn't this." Miriam walked over to him, her feet crunching on the grit of the alley. She didn't shrink away. She reached out and touched his arm, her fingers finding the tension in his bicep. "You protected me. You didn't leave me behind, and you didn't turn into a killer to prove a point." "I wanted to," he confessed, the darkness in his voice raw. "I wanted to break every bone in their bodies for touching a place where you felt safe. But you didn't," she said softly. "You chose to be the man who got me out. That's the version of you I care about." She stepped closer, the adrenaline of the attack giving way to a strange, heightened intimacy. In the shadow of the burning cafe, surrounded by the soot and the sounds of a crumbling piece, Chan-woo realized the test of fire hadn't been about Hai-Hai's strength. It had been about his restraint. "We need to move," he said, his internal radar sensing a secondary vehicle. "My people will be here in 2 minutes. They'll take you home." "Not home," Miriam said, her voice gaining a sudden, fierce strength. "They know where I work and now they might know where I live. If this is a war, Chan-woo, don't send me away to hide alone." Chan-woo looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the fire in her eyes that matched the one in the shop. He realized then that Miriam wasn't just a woman who could handle his size. She was a woman who could handle his world. Asterisk, the streets are screaming for blood, but the real battle is just beginning. To see if Chan-woo can protect Miriam without losing his soul, like, subscribe and share. The next chapter changes everything. Asterisk. The safe house was a fortress of cold stone and reinforced steel, tucked away in an industrial pocket of Brooklyn where the city's roar faded into a low, mechanical hum. Inside, the air was still, smelling of old paper and the sharp scent of the antiseptic Miriam had used to clean a small graze on Chanwoo's forearm. The adrenaline of the attack had cooled, leaving behind a heavy, electric tension that seemed to vibrate in the space between them. Chanwoo sat on the edge of a minimalist sofa, his shirt discarded, revealing the expansive landscape of his torso, a map of old scars and hard-earned muscle. He felt the familiar weight of his own skin, that sense of being too much, too large for the world around him. He watched Miriam as she packed away the first aid kit. She moved with a rhythmic, quiet grace that made the reinforced bunker feel like a home. "You should be terrified," Chanwoo said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Most people, after seeing a Molotov cocktail fly through a window because of the man they're with, don't ask to stay. They run. They realize that being near me is a death sentence." Miriam turned, leaning against a steel table, her arms crossed. She didn't look at the scars or the shadows in his eyes with pity. She looked at him with a weary kind of recognition. "You keep calling yourself a monster, Chanwoo. You think your world is the only one that bleeds," she said softly. She walked toward him, her footsteps light on the concrete floor. "I grew up in a neighborhood where the monsters didn't wear $5,000 suits. They wore masks and lived in the house next door. I've seen what real darkness looks like, the kind that enjoys hurting people just to feel powerful. I've seen men who use their size to diminish others." She stopped directly in front of him, forcing him to look up at her. "In that coffee shop, you had every excuse to be a monster. You could have left me to save yourself, or you could have gone out there and turned that street into a graveyard. But you didn't. You put your body over mine. You chose to be a shield." Chanwoo let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for a decade. "It doesn't change what I am, Miriam. It doesn't change the fact that even when I want to be gentle, I'm a freak. You saw the way that woman ran last week. You know the reality of it." Miriam reached out, her hands cupping his face. Her palms were warm, her touch firm and devoid of hesitation. "I'm a nurse, Chanwoo. I've seen the human body at its most broken and its most extreme. I don't see a complication when I look at you. I see a man who has been told he's too much for so long that he's forgotten he's enough." She leaned down, her forehead resting against his. The scent of vanilla and the lingering smoke of the day swirled between them. "I'm not afraid of you. Not your world and certainly not your body. I've spent my life learning how to heal things that are supposed to be broken. You think you're too big? Maybe the women you were with were just too small." The kiss that followed wasn't the desperate, transactional heat of the club or the fearful fumbling of his past rejections. It was slow, a deliberate claim. When Chanwoo pulled her closer, his large hands trembling slightly as they rested on her waist, he didn't feel the urge to pull back or apologize for his existence. For the first time as they moved toward the bedroom, the untouchable boss didn't feel like he was navigating a minefield. The shame that had lived in his marrow for years began to dissolve under the weight of her gaze. There was no panic in her eyes, only a fierce, hungry acceptance. In the dim light of the safe house, the man who ruled Lower Manhattan finally stopped fighting himself. He realized that Miriam wasn't just a woman who could handle his world. She was the only person who had ever truly seen the man beneath the armor. As they fell into the shadows together, the silence of the room was no longer a poison gas. It was a sanctuary. The afterglow of the safe house was short-lived. By the time the sun began to bleed over the Brooklyn horizon, the warmth of the bed had been replaced by the cold, biting reality of Chanwoo's world. He stood in the small kitchenette, watching the steam rise from a cup of black coffee, when his encrypted phone pulsed on the counter. It was Minho. There was no text, just a single file attachment labeled asterisk, priority, origins. Asterisk. Chanwoo felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He had asked Minho to vet Miriam's background, not out of distrust, but out of a protective instinct that had become second nature. He wanted to ensure no one from his world could use her past against her. He didn't expect to find that her past was already a weapon. He swiped the screen, and the face of the woman currently sleeping in the next room stared back at him from a grainier, older photograph. It wasn't Miriam Smith. The file identified her as Miriam Carter, and the location wasn't New York. It was Atlanta. Chan-woo leaned against the counter, his breath hitching as he scrolled through the police reports. 3 years ago, Miriam had been the primary suspect in the death of a man named Darius Webb. Webb hadn't been a nobody, he was a high-level enforcer for one of the most brutal crews in the South. The report stated he'd been found in an apartment with a single gunshot wound. Miriam had claimed self-defense, but the gun had never been found, and the witnesses had vanished into the shadows of the Georgia pines. But it was the secondary file that made Chan-woo's blood turn to ice. A confidential memo from the Fulton County District Attorney's Office suggested that the charges against Miriam Carter had been deferred in exchange for cooperation. There were logs of meetings with federal agents, dates, times, and locations. The implication was clear. Miriam hadn't just survived Atlanta, she had traded her way out of it. "Boss, you there?" Minho's voice crackled through the speaker as Chan-woo answered the follow-up call. "I'm here," Chan-woo said, his voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "There's more," Minho continued, his tone uncharacteristically grim. "The guy who died, Webb? He was an FBI informant. The feds were using him to build a RICO case against his own crew. When he turned up dead, the case fell apart. Miriam was the only lead they had. They didn't just let her go, boss. They relocated her. New name, new life, new social security number. It looks like a witness protection setup, but it's off the books. It's dirty." Chan-woo looked toward the bedroom door. The woman who had held him, who had looked at his scars and seen a man instead of a monster, was a phantom. Had she been sent to find him? Was the chance meeting at the club a calculated entry into the life of the city's most powerful boss? "Is she an agent?" Chan-woo asked, the words feeling like shards of glass in his throat. "I can't confirm that yet," Minho replied. "But she's definitely a ghost. And ghosts are usually sent by people who want to haunt you. You need to get out of there, Chan-woo. Now." Chan-woo hung up without a word. He looked at the coffee cup, now forgotten and cooling. He thought about the way she had touched his face in the dark, the way she had said he was enough. Was that a script? Was her acceptance of his complication just a tactic to bypass his defenses? The shame he had felt his entire life suddenly morphed into a searing, blinding rage. He wasn't a freak to her, he was a target. He walked back into the bedroom. Miriam was stirring, the sunlight catching the soft curve of her shoulder. She looked peaceful, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside him. He stood at the foot of the bed, his shadow stretching over her like a shroud. "Miriam," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth, stripped back to the cold steel of the Mafia boss. She opened her eyes, blinking against the light, a small smile forming on her lips. "Chan-woo? What's wrong?" "We need to go," he said, turning away so she couldn't see the betrayal in his eyes. "There's a warehouse on the waterfront. We have business to settle. The kind of business that doesn't involve coffee or bedside manners." The silence that followed was no longer a sanctuary. It was the quiet before a war. The man who finally found acceptance just discovered it might be a lie. Is Miriam a savior or a spy? To see the truth come out in the final confrontation, like, subscribe and hit the bell for the shocking conclusion. The drive to the waterfront was a descent into a cold, mechanical hell. Chan-woo sat in the back of the sedan, the silence between him and Miriam thick enough to choke the air from his lungs. Beside him, she sat huddled in her coat, her eyes darting toward him every few minutes, searching for the man who had held her hours before. All she found was a statue of ice and granite. His pocket felt heavy with the weight of the burner phone, the digital files from Minho burning a hole through his suit jacket. Miriam Carter. Atlanta. Federal informant. The words looped in his brain, each repetition eroding a piece of the peace he had fought so hard to find. He replayed every second they had spent together, looking for the tell, the slip-up, the moment she had checked her watch or led the conversation toward his business. Was the coffee shop attack a setup to gain his trust? Was her acceptance of his body, the one thing no other woman could tolerate, just a calculated psychological play designed to lower his guard? The thought that his deepest insecurity had been weaponized against him made the bile rise in his throat. He felt like a fool, a king who had opened the gates of his city because a woman told him he had a kind soul. "Chan-woo, talk to me," Miriam whispered, her hand tentatively reaching for his on the leather seat. "You've been a ghost since you got that call. This is about the Melanovs, let me help. I can stay with you. Chanwoo pulled his hand away as if her touch were a live wire. The rejection was sharp, visible in the way her shoulders slumped and her expression crumbled. "You've helped enough," he said, his voice a jagged rasp. He struggled with the warring halves of his soul. One side, the boss who had survived a dozen betrayals, demanded he hand her over to Minho for interrogation the moment they arrived. In his world, a shadow of a doubt was a death warrant. But the other side, the man who had finally felt seen, clung to the memory of her touch in the dark. He remembered the way she didn't flinch when she saw his scars. Could a federal agent fake that kind of raw, unflinching empathy? Could a trap feel that much like home? He looked out at the gray, churning waters of the East River. If he was wrong and she was loyal, he was about to destroy the only real thing he'd ever had. If he was wrong and she was a traitor, his empire and his life were already over. "We're here," the driver announced, the car rolling to a stop in front of the rusted, hulking silhouette of the Delancey warehouse. Chanwoo stepped out into the biting wind, the scent of salt and rotting wood filling his senses. He didn't offer Miriam a hand. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He walked toward the heavy steel doors, his heart a lead weight in his chest. He was going into this room to find out if he was a man who had found love, or a target who had found his end. "Go inside," he commanded, gesturing to the dimly lit interior of the warehouse. Miriam paused at the threshold, the wind whipping her hair across her face. "Chanwoo, whatever you think you know, just remember who was there when the glass started breaking." He didn't answer. He couldn't. He followed her into the dark, the heavy doors groaning shut behind them, sealing them away from the world. Inside, the light of a single industrial bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long, distorted shadows against the crates. It was a place for truth or a place for executions. Chanwoo reached into his pocket and pulled out the phone, the screen glowing with the face of the girl from Atlanta. The standoff had begun. The evidence is on the table and the hammer is back. To see the final truth of Miriam's past and the fate of the untouchable boss, like, subscribe, and don't miss the epic conclusion in the next chapter. The industrial bulb overhead flickered, casting long, skeletal shadows across the oil-stained concrete of the Delancey warehouse. Chanwoo stood by a rusted metal desk, the only piece of furniture in the vast, hollow space. He didn't look like the man who had shared a quiet coffee in the West Village. He looked like the ghost of his father, cold, calculating, and lethal. Miriam stood 10 feet away, her breath hitching in the frigid air. The sound of the river lapping against the pier outside was the only thing filling the silence. Without a word, Chanwoo reached into his coat and tossed a manila folder onto the desk. It landed with a heavy, final thud. "Miriam Carter," he said, the name sounding like a sentence. "Born in Atlanta. Wanted for the murder of Darius Webb. Relocated by federal handlers after a RICO case went south." Miriam froze. The color drained from her face, leaving her eyes looking enormous and dark in the dim light. She didn't look at the folder. She looked at Chanwoo, her hands trembling as she pulled her coat tighter around her. "I asked for the truth, Miriam," he continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating low. "I told you I was a freak. I showed you my scars. I let you into the one part of my life where I wasn't a king. And all the while, you were a ghost sent to haunt me. Was it a setup? Did the feds tell you that the untouchable boss had a weakness for a pretty face and a kind word?" "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Chanwoo, listen to me." "I'm done listening to the script," he roared, slamming his fist onto the desk. The sound echoed like a gunshot through the rafters. "I laid everything bare for you. I thought you were the only person on this earth who saw me. But you were just looking for a target. Was the bedroom part of the mission too? A little extra clinical research to keep the witness protection checks coming?" The insult hit her like a physical blow. Miriam's fear suddenly sparked into a familiar, defensive fire. She took a step toward the desk, her chin lifting. "You think the feds care about me?" she spat, her voice trembling with rage. "Darius Webb was a monster, Chanwoo. He was an informant, yes, but he was also a man who used his power to hurt women. He tried to kill me that night. I didn't trade my way out, I survived. The cooperation they claimed in those files? It was a lie they used to keep me on a leash. They didn't relocate me to protect me. They dumped me in New York with a new name so I wouldn't be their problem anymore. I worked 2 jobs and studied until my eyes bled just to have a life that wasn't covered in blood." She reached the desk and shoved the folder aside. I didn't know who you were when I saw you at the bar. I just saw a man who looked as lonely as I felt. I didn't stay because of a mission. I stayed because for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't the only person in the room with a secret they couldn't wash off. Chanwoo searched her face, his gaze searching for a flicker of deceit, a rehearsed tell. But all he saw was the raw, jagged honesty of a survivor. The mafia boss wanted to believe the files. The man wanted to believe her. The weapon, Miriam, he said quietly. The gun that killed Webb was never found. Miriam reached into her back. For a heartbeat, Chanwoo's hand moved toward the holster at his small of back, his instinct screaming. But she didn't pull a gun. She pulled out a small, tarnished silver key on a broken chain. I threw the gun in the Chattahoochee River 3 years ago, she said, her voice steady now. But I kept the key to the apartment where it happened. To remind myself never to be a victim again. If I were an agent, Chanwoo, I wouldn't be standing here in a warehouse with a man who could have me erased with a phone call. I'd be at the precinct signing your arrest warrant. She leaned over the desk, her eyes locking onto his. You told me you were a freak. I told you that you were enough. I meant it. But if you can't see past those files, then you really are the monster you think you are. So choose. The truth standing in front of you or the end of us. The silence returned, but the poison was gone. Chanwoo looked at the files, then at the woman who had stood her ground against a kingpin. He realized then that their bond wasn't built on perfection. It was built on the fact that they were both broken in ways the world couldn't understand. He reached out, his large hands slowly covering hers on the desk. He didn't pull her into an embrace, not yet. He simply stood with her in the dark, two ghosts finally finding a place to rest. Victor, Chanwoo said into his earpiece, his eyes never leaving Miriam's. Burn the files. Miriam Carter doesn't exist. And tell the Melanovs, tell them the boss is back and he's not alone anymore. The untouchable man had finally been touched, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of the marks it left behind. Asterisk, the king has his queen, and the city is about to find out what happens when a mafia boss has something worth fighting for. Thank you for watching this journey. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you want more stories of power, vulnerability, and the women who change everything. Asterisk.